we have a talk on generative AI landscape in India, and I request Professor Manish to kindly introduce the speaker, Professor Mitesh Khapra.
Thank you, Anaga. So, this session is basically titled the Generative AI Landscape for the Indian context, for Indian languages, right? And we have two excellent speakers, Professor Mitesh Khapra from IIT Madras and Professor Ravi Kiran from IIIT Hyderabad. And the idea is to cover in broad strokes where the generative AI revolution is leading our Indian NLP landscape, right? And it is my absolute pleasure and delight to introduce our first speaker, Professor Mitesh Khapra, who is joining us online. Professor Mitesh Khapra is an associate professor at Department of Computer Science and Engineering at IIT Madras, where he has received a lot of prestigious awards, including Google Faculty Research Award and IIT Madras Young Faculty Recognition Award. He also, for most of us, he is known as the face of AI for Bharat. That's the short name that we know it for as. But he heads the AI for Bharat Research Lab at IIT Madras and has been contributing uh, to revolutionize the Indian NLP landscape. There is another part of this story which would come an hour or so later, which we will cover then. Right. Professor Mitesh Khapra has his research published in almost all the top forums in NLP research across the world. He has worked at, working at IIT Madras, he was working with IBM Research Lab. And before that, he was an esteemed member as a research scholar at IIT Madras at Center for Indian Language Technologies under Professor Pushpa Bhattacharya. It's my, again, did I say IIT Madras? I am sorry, IIT Madras at Center for Indian Language Technology under Professor Prof. Bhattacharya. Once again, it's my absolute pleasure to welcome Professor Mitesh Khapra. Over to you, Mitesh.
Yeah. Thanks, Manish, for the generous introduction. And the second time also you mentioned IIT Madras, so I will correct you as IIT Bombay, Center for Indian
No,
Language
Pushpak sir
Technology.
corrected me and I corrected that.
No,
I'm
no,
sorry.
second time again you said IIT Madras actually.
So,
Okay.
just to be clear, PhD and MTech from IIT Bombay under Professor Pushpak Bhattacharya. Over to you, Mitesh. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye. Okay. So let me start. So I'll talk broadly about Gen AI for India, right? And share my thoughts on what I think about where we are, where should go, and so on. Right? But before we talk about Gen AI, right, let's talk about what has happened to language technology in India for the past few years. And I'll talk about this in the context of Bhashini, where multiple research groups have been associated with Bhashini as consortia, as different, working on different language technology verticals, and several contributions have been made. And all of these efforts have gone towards building the foundation to enable machines to understand the rich and diverse lives of India's, the rich and diverse languages of India. Right? And there are several verticals. A few of them are listed here: speech recognition, optical character recognition, machine translation, speech synthesis, transliteration. Others work on natural language understanding. All of this happening under this project Bhashini, right? And what all of us have been trying to do is build this ramp, right, where we create foundational datasets at a certain scale, at a certain size, which is respectable for modern AI, right? To give you a sort of example of that, we all know that a lot of modern English ASR systems are trained on the Libri speech dataset. Of course, now they're trained on much larger datasets, but Libri speech is a standard dataset which has 1,000 hours of transcribed audio, right? So can we create at least 1,000 hours of transcribed audio for each of the major Indian languages? Was one of the goals that was set out for Bhashini, right? To build this foundational layer of datasets for all the language technologies or verticals that I have listed here, right? And once you have this data, build multilingual models, which then enable these technologies across different languages. And finally, a missing piece is evaluation. So it's a much of evaluation on the progress of ASR or machine translation has always been in the Western context. Hence, a lot of metrics that are currently used have been inherited from English and other languages, and they may or may not be really suitable for Indian context. Just not metrics, but also data sets. For example, one of the most popular benchmarks for machine translation today is the Flores benchmark released by Meta, but it contains sentences which are originating in the Western context, and then they are translated to multiple languages to make a n-way parallel data set, right? But now can we make a benchmark which is originating in India, which has sentences about Bharatnatyam, has sentences about the first war of independence of India, and then decide to evaluate how well do our machine translation systems work on these contexts from of Indian context, right? And while this ramp is being built, there's also this loop where deployments are happening in parallel through partners like Bhashini, where in multiple government use cases, the models are getting deployed, be it Supreme Court, Hello UPI, PM Kisan, language learning, and so on. And the idea is to drive impact, right, through inclusion. So all of this, the reason I'm talking about all of this is that this ramp is already being built, right? And it's like made significant progress over the past few years. And of course, this has been building on the traditional work that has been happening for many years in India on NLP. But there is a sort of effort to accelerate the growth of Indian language technology even further, right? Now, while all this was happening on these non-LLM technologies, for the want of a better word, we also had work on LLMs, right? So there were the Gen Zero LLMs where foundational data sets were being built, monolingual corpora for Indian languages, the BERT, BART, the Gen Zero type of models, right? Which are not very large scale, which are not trained on huge amounts of data. They're trained on sane amounts of data as opposed to the insane amounts of data used today, and some traditional benchmark, right? All of this was also being built for Indian languages when we were hit with this Gen AI quake, right? The Chat GPT moment or the Gen AI quake, where everyone got excited about, hey, this is something exponential jump from where NLP technology or language technology was there. And now we are seeing an exponential jump. And now what should we do, right? What can we do in response was a question, right? And this ChatGPT moment sort of triggered discussions in the Indian context that what should India's response be? Should we just wait and watch? Is this hype? Can we build it in India? If so, how should we build? Should we even try to build an Indic LLM? And what are the resources required for them and so on? But even before all of that, there are a basic question on what exactly do we mean by Indic LLM, right? So let's try to decode that Indic LLM. So when we say Indic LLM, do we mean LLMs for Indian use cases? Because that is a valid definition of Indic LLM. Or do we mean LLMs of Indian language, right? So it's a language model, it's a model of a language. So do we mean model of Indian languages? Or do we mean LLMs built by Indians, right? So is it for Indians, of Indians, by Indians is the question, right? And now, if you look at the first one, which is for Indian use cases, then that is actually possible even today, or that was even possible 1.5 years back when ChatGPT had just not 1.5, now almost 2 years back, but say 3 to 4 months after the ChatGPT moment, it was already possible where people were building solutions on top of ChatGPT by using traditional language technology like machine translation or speech recognition or speech synthesis or a combination of this. A classic example of this is RAG-style bots, whereas there is an Indian user who is coming and giving his or her query in their native language. The query gets translated to English because the LLM is good at reasoning in English. The LLM again creates an answer in English, translates it back to the native language, and then the answer either gets shown in the form of a text or gets synthesized as speech and is returned back to the user, right? So this is already possible, or was already possible even 1.5 years back, right? So if that is what we mean, then we are already there and we could focus on seeing how to improve this further. If you mean that we want LLMs of Indian languages, then we need to ensure that we have a large amount of Indian tokens. Right? Tokens is a common terminology now. It just means a corpus. By tokens, I just mean corpus, that we should have a large collection of documents written in Indian languages and about Indian content, Indian context, right? An example of that would be documents containing all the legislative articles in India, or all the Supreme Court judgments in India, or all about all the government schemes, about Ayurveda, about anything which is Indian to begin with, right? So not just tokens, but also content should be Indian. It should not be, say, an article on Trump written in Indian language, which is also welcome, but also originating in India, right? So that's what would take to build a model of Indian languages, right? And if it's about the third, where we are talking about by Indians, then we want the models to be trained in India by Indians. We need to be involved at all the stages that go into a modern LLM, which is not just pre-training, but also instruction fine-tuning, making sure that the models are aligned with Indian preferences, Indian culture, Indian values, are devoid of biases which exist in the Indian context. And we do a robust evaluation such that we can show that the model is fair and inclusive across a diverse demographic of Indian population, which speaks different languages, may have different needs, may respond to different culture, have different cultural preferences, and so on. Right? So that is what would mean by LLMs built by Indians ground up, by rooting all of these decisions in the Indian context. Right? So now, if you look at these three, for Indians, of Indian languages, and by Indians, then the first goal is in the short term, right? As I said, this is already possible, right? This is already being done. Many people are trying to build solutions on top of existing LLMs by interfacing them with language technology. The middle one is the midterm, I would say, right? In the midterm, we should try to see if we can build a lot of content or a corpus which is rooted in Indian content and contains tokens from Indian languages. And in the long term, we should set up not only the large scale data infrastructure, but the large scale compute infrastructure, as well as the talent required for building these models in India ground up, right? So that's like a perspective on what we could mean by Indic LLMs and what each of these definitions would mean in terms of time, right? Another way of looking at this is that in short term, we need to empower Indians with AI solutions built on top of LLMs. We should make sure that they are not left behind in this use case drive of the use case wave of LLMs, right? Where a lot of LLMs solutions are being built, and just because they are not natively in Indian languages, we should ensure that our population is not left behind. And this kind of integration of language technology, such as machine translation or speech recognition with an LLM, should be able to power these solutions. Right? In the midterm, which is the part where I was talking about collecting Indian content, Indian tokens, this is to champion Indian languages in the next generation of LLMs. Now, what do I mean by that? If, as an ecosystem, we all come together and release a large amount of good Indian content corpus out there, then there is no reason why any of the open source or even proprietary efforts on building the next LLM, right, be it GPT-5 or be it Llama 4, should not use this readily available content to include it in their pre-training cycles or even in their instruction fine-tuning cycles, right? So that is what I mean by champion Indian languages in the next generation of LLMs, by simply putting out a lot of data, which is, it should be a no-brainer for anyone to just pick up and add it to their next training cycles, right? And the third, which is the long term, is to lead the way with sovereign models rooted in Indian needs, culture, and value. Right? So that's a different way of framing that. And a more technical way of framing that would be that during pre-training, get the tokens in. During fine-tuning, focus on specific use cases so that it works for the Indian population. And during alignment, make sure that we make the right choices so that it understands Indian preferences. Right? Now, given this context, what will it take to get there, right? So there are three important pieces to the puzzle, and no surprises here, I guess, to this audience. One is talent. I genuinely believe, and I know there could be differing opinions on this, but I think that we have enough talent in India to build Indic LLMs. I'm aware of at least 2 to 3 efforts where LLMs have already been built, ground up in India, or will be built in the next few months, right? So I'm not really worried about talent. And if we don't have talent, I think getting talent or creating talent is not an issue, in my personal opinion. And I'm agreeing to the fact that this is open to debate. But my opinion would be we have the talent, right? Data. We do not have enough data to build Indic LLMs, right? So we have to make sure that we first create this data infrastructure. And I'll talk a bit more about what kind of data we should look at for building Indian LLMs. And the third is compute, right? We simply do not have enough compute to build Indic LLMs. We all hear news articles about how much compute is procured by the deep tech industry, be it Meta, Google, Microsoft, to train and run these LLMs. I don't we are simply nowhere close to this as a country. Fortunately, we have certain initiatives going on, in particular the India AI mission, where both data and compute, and I think skill also, talent also happens to be an important pillar. And I'm sure we'll make more progress along that, right? But some of this has to be done organically, and I'll talk a bit more about data, right? So this data bottleneck, right, needs a moonshot effort. Now, why do I say that? If you look at the latest Llama model, which is a good sort of ballpark to have, because it is in the open, there are at least some statistics available about the amount of data that was used. It was 15 trillion tokens which was used, right? So let's assume that, say, 5 trillion tokens of that is code and other languages and so on, which is still a bit of an exaggeration. I think that would just be around 1 to 2 trillion tokens. But just to get a round number, at least 10 trillion tokens of English knowledge are there in that data which was used to train Llama, even the 7 billion or even the bigger size. Right? Now, what would it take to get there? Because today, if you look at all the content out there, which is machine readable, available on the internet, we are not even touching 1 trillion tokens. We are not even touching half a trillion tokens. Right? We are somewhere between 100 billion tokens to 500 billion tokens, which is significantly less than the 10 trillion token that we should set up. And this is again summed up across all the languages. I'm not talking about one language here, but summed up across all the languages. But let's assume that if we have collectively 10 trillion, that's good enough to think about training a model ground up in India. Right? Now, what should that data look like? Right? So if you look at it, what are LLMs being used? Right? A lot of the magic of LLMs in its knowledge about the world, right? And this knowledge, unfortunately, is largely available in English. Right? You wouldn't find an article on the first war of independence in each of the 22 languages on Wikipedia or any other online resource. Right? You wouldn't find an article on the Battle of Panipat in each of the 22 languages online or Wikipedia or anywhere else, right? But you have these articles available in English. So the world knowledge is sort of largely skewed towards being available in English. Can we do something about making it available in Indian language? And given the gap that where we are, I don't think creating it from scratch with the help of humans is going to get us there. It's just going to take us a lot of time to get there. And here, at least my recommendation is that we look at synthetic data, where we use open source models like Llama to synthesize some of this content in English because they have this world knowledge, and then use translation and appropriate filters or distillation to distill this knowledge into an Indian corpus. And I'm talking about data distillation here, using a large language model to create data which is of interest to us through translation as a pipeline, right? So that's one important pillar required in the data, which is capture the knowledge of the world. The second important pillar is to capture the essence of the language, right? So one criticism for using a lot of synthesized data, at least, especially through the translation route, is that you would get this translationese effect where your sentences then would not sound very natural, right? But I'm looking at that pillar only from a knowledge transfer perspective, or only from the perspective of capturing the knowledge of the world. There has to be another pillar which captures the essence of the language, the grammar of the language, the structure of the language, right? And this, in my opinion, would require a smaller amount of well-curated data, be it from well-written books available in Indian languages, well-written content on the web, or even well-spoken content in the form of speeches or podcasts. All of this can be curated to distill into this essence of the language that we are trying to build an LLM for, right? So that's the second pillar of data which is needed. And okay, I finished the third, and then I'll come back to one more statement that I wanted to make. And the third is the culture specific, right? Can I ask an LLM today about what does an average person do on the day of Diwali from 6 a.m. to 11 p.m. in the district of Dharwad, right? And I want to take such 10,000, 1 lakh questions, the number could be anything, and go to every district in the country and ask them, right? So what are the rituals performed from the day of the Roka ceremony or the pre-engagement to the wedding day in your district or in your village, right? Or in your culture, right? What are the different rituals performed or after the death of an individual in your culture or in your village, right? And it could be after the funeral, 13 days, in some cases there are 30 days, what all is performed during that period. And you could think of a long list of such questions, which actually captures the cultural essence of India, and not just like a centralized cultural essence, but really distributed across the different villages, districts of India, right? And this would require an effort where we go across the country, right? This would be a large scale effort, similar to some of the Indic Voices effort that we're doing as a part of Bashini, where we actually go across the country, interview people, and ask them these questions in the form of prompt response plays, right? And my sense is that there is an order of difference in the amount of data required for each of these. If we require 10 trillion tokens to capture all the world knowledge, then perhaps we require 100 billion tokens to capture the essence of the language, and maybe 10 billion tokens to capture the culture of the language. Right? So that's my estimate. It could be up or down, but at least I'm very clear that these three pillars of data are required. And unless we have this, there's no sense of even attempting to build an LLM for Indian languages, because it will not really be Indic the way we want it to be. And all of this would sort of contribute to the 10 trillion token target that I would like to set for training an Indic LLM. Of course, these numbers can be a bit up or down. It could be 20 trillion, it could be 10 trillion. But the overall message that I'm trying to give is that it has to be a significant size, and it has to capture these different segments of knowledge that we care about. Okay. And once we have that, the other important thing which is missing is to do robust evaluations, right? So currently it's like an open, clearly acknowledged or clearly understood among the academic circles that LLM evaluations are completely flawed. There is data contamination. The leaderboards are often on very simpler tasks as opposed to the actual power of an LLM in generating or giving recommendations or synthesizing content and so on. So there's not enough robust evaluation of LLMs. And when we sort of plan our journey for Indic LLM as a country, we should focus on evaluations which are grounded in use cases, right? And here's where the India AI mission, as well as the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology, which is trying to set up an initiative for building the AI pillars for the country, we should have evaluation as a very important pillar in that. And to give you a sense of it, right? So there is a lot of talk about building bots for different applications. Now, bot has become like a all-encompassing word for any AI application that is being built. Now, what do you need to evaluate these bots, right? So you need to make sure that the bot really understands different types of intents, be it asking for decisions or trying to solve a complex problem or trying to just do a brainstorming with the bot. Different styles of speaking. This includes languages, dialects, accents, emotions, all of it, right? And then different personas, right? With people from different backgrounds, they want to interact with the bot. All of this has to be evaluated, right? And if you think of it, current LLM evaluation, it's like a standalone data set on which you just keep trying to track the numbers and improve that, which captures none of this, right? None of the complexity of a downstream application is captured in that. So can we come up with automatic ways of evaluating that with an LLM plus human in the loop, or a human-centric evaluation where we get people to interact with these test bots and give their opinion on whether it works for their dialect, or have some automatic metrics of capturing this through the interactions that real people have with the bots, as opposed to evaluating them on a standalone data set, right? So a lot more work needs to be done on evaluations. How are we doing on time?
Mitesh, we have 2 minutes.
Okay, sure. I'll wrap up. Yeah.
Thanks.
And this is the last point I want to make, that if we are thinking about LLMs, we have to be mindful that voice is India's most natural interface. We are not really very good at typing in our languages, nor are we very good at consuming written content in the form of reading in our language, right? So even if we magically have these 10 billion tokens, we build an LLM of the right size. Now, when a user comes to interact with them, this is a text LLM, and the user may want to speak, or the user may want to type in Romanized form, because we're not very good at typing in our languages. So we would use one of these proxies. We need the peripheral technology of identifying toxicity, language ID, etc. And if the LLM still happens to be better in reasoning in English, we may have to translate the content to English in addition to feeding it in the regional language. Then feed it to the LLM, do the reasoning, get the answer back, and then synthesize, right? So a lot of this peripheral technology is also integral. It's not just about building LLMs, but ensuring that we improve voice technology end to end. That means speech recognition, speech synthesis, all of it. This is what we need to do in short term for the peripheral technologies. In the long term, we should see if we can directly leapfrog to voice LLMs, where the input and output both is in speech. And here, this has to be done a bit smartly so that whatever investments we make in the short term in terms of creating data sets for improving ASR and TPS systems, can they be leveraged later on for building the voice LLM end to end? Right? So I'll end here. Thank you. I'll be happy to hear any comments or questions.
Thank you, Mitesh. Thank you, Mitesh. If there are any questions. Just we'll take one question.
Dr. Mitesh, thanks for the nice presentation. I want to supplement on the infrastructure that the national program on AI has already put out a tender for putting up a large infrastructure. So that may not remain the bottleneck in the near future.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarlata ma'am.